fine, but my voice is chalash, I would say, not strong. So we'll see how far I can go. Made it through class this morning. The number of cough drops I have consumed over the last week it's just got to be toxic in some way.
Ludens ones, the red ones,
Yeah.
like candy.
Yeah, yeah.
My favorite.
So thank you for indulging me. So, what's that, Eddie? Put something in there? That's not water.
Could be gin, could be vodka.
Not water. Shlivovitz is what's in there.
The Mechaya Le'olam has a...
So let's think a little bit about Kitavo. Begins with an interesting passage. We spent a minute or two talking about it in the Midrash class this morning, which is the Arameo Ved Avi passage. My father is a wandering Aramean. You are familiar with that passage, if not from the Parsha, probably and actually more likely from the Haggadah, because it's a central component of the Haggadah. And in the Haggadah, it's used as the springboard for that long, extended midrashic section that you find in the middle of the Haggadah. So I guess just to start out, any thoughts about my father was a wandering Aramean?
You know, I mean, this year, I think in particular, as we're reading passages of Torah, it feels like we're reading them in a way that's different than ever before because the world feels like it's different than it has been in many of our lifetimes. This passage is really standing out to me lately because in many ways it reminds us of the importance of stories in passing down or transmitting our identity, our values from generation to generation and really to the world. One of the interesting things that I've been thinking about lately is I was at a conference in New York, the Anti-Defamation League's Never Is Now conference, and there was a speaker in one of the sessions, and she said, facts are out and stories are in. Experts are out and influencers are in, right? So there's this idea that, and I think it comes up in a lot of ways in our world today, that feelings have replaced facts, and in many ways the story, the personal narrative is the only way that we change hearts and minds. And I think that that's applicable to a lot of things in our world in a really important approach, but I think that this taps into, you tell our story and that makes a difference.
It is it's a kind of very concise, right? But a telling of the story. Ben, thoughts on
Yeah, the particular part of the parasha is one I've been focusing on a lot, especially this time of year. If you were in services, I gave a Devar Torah yesterday, it was Friday, about the idea of Hamelech Basadeh, the king is in the field this time of year in Elul, which connects to this Arameo Ved Avi because it's about the Bikurim ceremony. It's a very agricultural component, and our connection with the land of Israel very strong. So I've been thinking a lot about that. And the Bikurim ceremony in general, which is a core part of the temple rituals for the holiday of Shavuot. But an interesting thing about it, as we learned from our sages, is that this passage was recited by everyone who brought their Bikurim to the temple. But the interesting thing to say is that if you didn't know how to read it, the priest would say it for you and you would repeat it. So it's this idea of inclusivity and acceptability for everyone. So if you could read, if you couldn't read, everybody had to repeat it from the priest as this sort of way to include everyone, that no one should feel embarrassed. And this time of year, it's really dwelling on me a lot.
Resonates.
Yeah, resonating with me a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that's interesting about it is that if you go through the Torah, there is very little, almost no prescribed liturgy. Almost none. I mean, anywhere in the Torah. Prescribed liturgy, in other words, almost nowhere in the Torah does it say, you should say these words, like a prayer. Almost nowhere in the Torah. This is the one exception to that. So that in and of itself is kind of interesting. And
it's almost like they were given a script.
Oh, for sure,
right?
100%. It's like our prayer, this is what you say, you say these words.
Particularly elaborate rituals on Shavuot as well, so very interesting.
Very elaborate on Shavuos, for sure. The other thing that's interesting about it is, yes, this sort of concise, Jewish history, but it omits Sinai. It omits Sinai. It goes from Exodus to Egypt to arriving in the land. There's no mention of the Sinai experience, which has always been kind of a fascinating thing. Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like, when you're telling a story to people who sort of like know the story, you don't need to tell all of it. You get the highlights. We all know from Sinai, everybody was there, right? Our tradition teaches us we all were there as well. So it wasn't really necessary to sort of mention, I think, the Sinai experience, because at the end of the day, God took us out of the land of Egypt, super important, and then our connection, again, going into the land of Israel, also super important. Yes, Sinai happened, we received these laws, and that was what we spent the most of the book of Bamidbar doing. So I think you don't need to mention, you can get the highlight.
It might also be, and I think it's interesting to think about, it's not sort of one of those parts that we talk about often, but there's a scene in the midst of sort of that comes after this and before the mountains and the blessings and the curses, which is that Joshua is instructed to pick up stones from the Jordan, and on those stones are supposed to go words of Torah, and so maybe they don't mention Sinai because they've been reminded more recently.
Back in later with that.
But I think it's actually really interesting to dive a little bit deeper into the experience of the Bikurim, right? So before they say that script, there's so much pomp and circumstance involved in this Bikurim offering of fruits, and those fruits are really of the 7 species. And the way that it works is that there's like everyone goes and they're supposed to sleep in the streets the night before they do this, because they don't want to go to a home where they might get sick or some, like a contagious disease or become ritually impure. And so they sleep in the streets. And then the next day someone like screams out like, everyone, let's go to Zion. And they like go forth. And it's a whole bunch of like, they have an ox in the front, and the ox has like a beautiful headband of olives.
They paint the horns gold.
They paint the horns gold, and then there's a flautist who's playing and accompanying them, and they get to the city, and all the artisans come out, and everyone welcomes the inhabitants of whatever land they're in. Like, it's really exciting, and it feels really joyful.
Yeah.
And I think in some ways, like, it reminds me of like, we're coming into the holidays. Like, there's a lot of like beauty and pomp and circumstance, and that has value also. Sometimes I think, we're treating everything very informally in our world today, but there's something beautiful about really sort of elevating an experience. Yeah.
You should really rejoice in it.
Yeah, 100%. And that description of the ritual, or what precedes the verbal ritual that we have in the Parsha, that incredible sort of parade really into the city, and
parade.
All of the celebration around that. So that was a Shavuot ritual. It's described in the Mishnah, and a few of you in the room are old enough to remember when that was reflected here at Beth El by the children in the Hebrew school, who would prepare for months and months. Leslie's nodding her head. And on Shavuot, would have a kind of recreation of that parade, that procession that Rabbi Saroken is talking about, bringing first fruits down, laying them at the foot of the shulchan, and all this kind of, and singing songs and dressing in white and all that kind of business.
It was Rochelle Lipovsky, yeah?
Yes, Rochelle Lipovsky was very, very involved in coordinating all of that, and Sandy Winters for many, many years as well. And also, interestingly, because you referred at the end of the Parsha to the business of getting some people on one mountain and some folks on the other mountain, and putting the people, the bulk of the people in between, and some of the people on one mountain saying the curses, and the folks on the other mountains, it's starting to sound like a joke, saying the blessings, but the people in the middle, their responsibility is to respond, Amen. And so we did a midrash this morning in the midrash class that focused on the word Amen and how it's used throughout Tanakh, what is sort of the nuance of it, what is the valence of it. And this morning when Cantor started with the Birchot HaShachar, we stood up, I happened to catch Steve's eye, because we're responding as a congregation to those blessings by saying Amen. We say Amen. And just the exchange that we had thinking about Amen historically in the Midrashic tradition, how it was used going back into Torah times. And here we are today, 3,000 years later, and responding Amen to blessing still today. It's really kind of a striking thing.
That is nice. And it's an interesting, I'd love to just touch on that too for a minute, but those two mountains, Ebal and Gezerim, it's a really interesting thing that you had, some of the tribes on one mountain and some of them on the other, and then in the middle you had the ark, in the valley in the middle, you had the ark, then you had a circle around the ark, which was the priests, and then you had another circle outside of the priests, which were, was it the Levites that were outside? Priests, Levites, and then the rest. And I just think there was such order. There's such an orderliness to it.
For sure.
But I also wonder about, thinking about all of those curses being sort of shouted out as possibilities, in our world, being spoken out loud, and then people needing to say Amen. I wonder if that was scary. I wonder if it was a moment where, fear was sort of put into them, or I just wonder what that experience was like, right? In some ways, we know their part was to say Amen, but what were they feeling at that time when the blessings were said and then when the curses were said?
Yeah, I would imagine trepidation. Yeah, for sure. It'd be an interesting exercise one day when we get to Ki Tavo to maybe after the Kriya or something, go through the English, read it out loud, and folks in the congregation can respond Amen.
Yeah.
Each time it says it in the text, it would be interesting. Would be interesting.
We could divide into tribal teams.
Yeah. Could reenact.
Climb the
That's
mountain.
a big part of our liturgy is reenactment.
Yeah.
Okay.
Ben, do you have any particular experience reading those words?
Yeah. So, just gonna. When I read the Torah every week, all of the people in it become sort of like my best friends. Moshe is like my best friend. We spend a lot of time in the Torah with him all the year. But when it comes to this part of the Torah, especially towards the end, because it's no accident that the end of the Torah is so close to the Yamim Noraim, the High Holy Days, and the themes that come out of that are really particularly strong. So when I think about HaMelech Basadeh, the king is in the field, I think about this time of year and these blessings and these curses, and when you read them, it's powerful because speaking words, I think gives putting them out into the universe is powerful. It's an act of creation, right? When we string words together, we're participating in that act of creation, which itself is holy. And thinking about what kind of person you want to be for the coming year, and really what does it mean to obey God's laws? What does it mean to really be all in the covenant? And this time of year is really very powerful when you read those, and I think a lot about what it must have been like to be there on the mountain or in the valley and hear those things spoken. It must have been quite something.
And so maybe we'll kind of get towards wrapping up with this, but Rabbi Saroken, you had said a minute or two ago that interesting the timing of this parsha, just 10 days or so before Rosh Hashanah.
Yeah. So, it is an interesting, I feel like this parsha raises so many things that feel pertinent or relevant to this stretch of Elul and going into the holidays. One is, just this question of blessings and curses and what will be for us.
Mm-hmm.
I think the
Sort
other.
of Unatan and Tokef.
Yeah. Tokef
Ish.
ish.
Yeah.
Yeah. That idea of, right, that all of these things are a possibility, and that question of whether our actions are deeds, staying true to God, sort of following the mitzvot, if they can be helpful to us in living a better life that, please God, is filled with an experience of tipping toward blessings.
So tshuva, tefillah, tzedakah,
Yeah.
ma'avirina,
Yeah.
zera. Yeah.
And also the idea that Moshe's life is coming to an end. And that there will be things that he won't live to see or do. And that will be true of all of us at some point. And like, how can we live each day as if like it were precious?
Yep.
Even when, it's, even when blessings come and even when
Challenges.
the challenges come our
Yeah,
way.
yeah,
So
yeah.
what about you?
Yeah, well, along those lines, also, what we hope for at the beginning of a new year, very much what you said, and there's a wonderful tradition which we, year in and year out, do in our home for Rosh Hashanah, which is to put the head of a fish on the Rosh Hashanah table. So, how many of you do that?
I'm the sheep.
We use gummy fish.
Gummy fish?
I'm
Just the head,
Nice
just the
bite.
heads? Just the heads. So we actually, you have to go and reserve it. Usually Wegmans has fish heads around. So no, this is a real thing. In Sephardic tradition,
The goat, it's a
sometimes
sheep's head. It's
sheep's head on
good,
the
and you can
table.
slice off the
Head of a
cheeks
sheep.
and eat them delicious.
Well, at least the sheep's head you could eat some of it.
Yeah, you can get it.
But-
I've done it before, and I'll do it again.
But why? No, but why the fish head? And it comes from this parsha, this week's parsha. And there's a verse in the parsha which says, "Niyeh la rosh velo lazanav," that we should be at the beginning of a year the heads and not the tails. So we hope that for all of us. Have a good
Amen.
Shabbos, everybody. Shabbat shalom.